The night in Copenhagen is not just dark. It is a suffocating liquid blackness that seems to swallow the weak glow of the distant street lamps. It carries a new smell, cutting through the familiar scents of salt and fish from the harbor. It is the odor of cold metal, of burnt coal from idling trucks, and beneath it, a faint, sickly sweet trace of fear, human and collective. In a third-floor apartment, every creak of the old wooden floor is a seismic event. Dr. Leo Stern does not breathe. He listens. His hearing, sharpened by months of paranoia, has become a scientific instrument, parsing the soundscape of the occupied city. The normal groans of the building are baseline data. The distant, irregular rumble of a heavy engine is an anomaly. The sharp, synchronized echo of boots on cobblestones 3 streets over is a critical reading, a trend line pointing toward disaster. His wife, Elsa, is a statue carved from tension. She perches on the very edge of an armchair, her arms wrapped around their sleeping daughter, Anna. The child's face is pale, her breathing shallow even in sleep, as if her subconscious is practicing silence. Elsa's eyes are wide, unblinking, fixed on the thin line of light under the apartment door. She is not looking for something to enter. She is measuring the shadow of feet that might pause there. Leo's own suitcase, a pathetic vessel for a vanished life, contains only the artifacts of survival and 2 betrayals. A photograph of his parents, left behind in Berlin, and his doctoral thesis, its pages now serving as insulation for a small, hard loaf of bread. The world of abstract physics has collapsed into brutal, tangible equations. 1 suitcase equals 1 chance. 1 sound equals capture. 1 wrong step equals death. The signal comes, 3 short, soft taps on the water pipe in the kitchen, followed by a pause, then 2 more. It is time. The movement that follows is a silent, terrifying ballet. Anna is awakened not with a word, but with a firm hand over her mouth and a look that transmits pure urgency. Her childish confusion lasts only a second, before it is replaced by an understanding far too old for her eyes. They have rehearsed this. They descend the back staircase, a narrow void of peeling paint and the smell of garbage. Each step is a calculated negotiation with gravity, heel to toe, distributing weight to avoid the telltale groan of wood. They are molecules moving against entropy, striving for order in the chaos. The alley behind the building is a canyon of darkness. The promised guide is a deeper shadow against the brick wall. He gives no greeting, only a sharp gesture toward the mouth of the alley. As they glide forward, a sudden blaze of light slices across the street entrance just ahead. The roar of a Kubelwagen military vehicle fills the world. Leo shoves Elsa and Anna back into a recessed doorway, his body a shield. The vehicle idles, its headlights painting the opposite wall in a stark white. They can hear voices, guttural laughter, the scratch of a match. The beam of a flashlight dances playfully across the alley entrance, inches from their hiding spot. Leo feels Anna's tiny body trembling against his leg. He counts the seconds, his mind calculating the statistical probability of a patrol deciding to investigate a random alley. The numbers are not in their favor. The engine revs. The vehicle lurches forward, the light sweeps away, and the sound recedes. The guide lets out a breath that sounds like a sob. They run. The secondary dock is a skeletal finger of rotten wood, jutting into the ink-black water. The fishing boat Inge is a creature of shadow and tar, its single mast a bare spike against the sky. As they scramble aboard, the deck slick and uneven beneath them, a figure, detaches itself from a pile of nets. It is Dr. Carl Wagner. The sight is a physical blow. Wagner, once plump and jovial, is a specter. His clothes hang on a skeletal frame. His face is a map of starvation and terror, eyes sunk deep into bruised sockets, but burning with a manic intensity. He does not look like a colleague. He looks like a ghost who has crawled out of the grave that Germany has become. He stumbles toward Leo, his movements jerky. He clutches Leo's coat with bony, desperate fingers. His breath is sour with hunger and despair. Their program is a ghost train, Wagner rasps, his voice a dry leaf crushed underfoot. It runs on rails of pride into a tunnel of ignorance. They are blind, but they are furious. They are digging in the dark, and they will break the world trying to find a light. He is not conveying information. He is confessing a nightmare. He shoves a small, oilskin-wrapped packet into Leo's hand. The contact is icy. They listen everywhere, but they are deaf to truth. They crave only the answer they have already written. Give them a different one. Before Leo can react, Wagner's gaze shifts to a point behind him, over the water. His eyes widen in pure, unadulterated horror, as if he has seen Medusa herself. He shoves Leo away with surprising force, back toward the boat's cabin, and then simply turns and runs, his form dissolving into the maze of crates and shadows on the dock. He does not look back. The boat's engine explodes into life, a shocking, violent sound that shatters the night's silence. The deck lurches as it pulls away. Leo stumbles, clutching the packet, watching the dock shrink. Suddenly, from the darkness where Wagner disappeared, a new sound erupts. Not a shout, but a short, choked cry, instantly cut off. Then the sharp, unmistakable crack of a single pistol shot. It echoes once across the water and is swallowed by the night. The message is clear. The channel is now one way. The cost has been paid in advance. Leo stands frozen at the stern, the cold packet burning in his hand like a piece of radioactive ore. Elsa pulls at his arm, her face a mask of pleading, wanting him to come below, to hide. He cannot move. He watches Copenhagen, the city of his intellect, of Niels Bohr's Institute, of light and reason, recede into a formless smudge. It is no longer home. It is the source of the infection. With mechanical slowness, he unwraps the oilskin. Inside is a single sheet of high-quality paper, covered in Wagner's precise technical handwriting. It is not a letter. It is a key. Coordinates for a dead drop in Stockholm. Chemical formulas that are ciphers for contact windows. And in the margin, a small scribbled diagram, a schematic of a reactor cooling system with a single deliberate catastrophic flaw circled in faint pencil. A sample. A proof of concept for sabotage. This is not an invitation. It is a transfusion of purpose. Leo pulls out his silver lighter, the one from Bohr. The flame that ignites is small, a fragile tear of yellow in the vast blackness. He holds the edge of the paper to it. The knowledge does not burn with a protest. It surrenders eagerly, curling in on itself, transforming from a deadly secret into harmless, floating, black flakes. But he does not burn it all. He snuffs the flame at the last second, saving the corner with the flawed diagram. He tucks this smoking fragment into his inner pocket, against his heart. It is no longer just information. It is a seed, and it has found fertile soil. He finally turns from the vanishing horizon. He looks at his wife and daughter, shivering in the boat's cramped cabin, the people he must protect. Then he looks down at his own hands, still smudged with the soot from the burned paper. They are the hands of a scientist. They are the hands of a fugitive. And now, he understands with a chilling, absolute clarity. They are the hands of a weapon. The boat pushes forward into the open sea, toward the neutral void of Sweden. Behind them, the darkness is complete. Before them, only more darkness. But inside Leo's stern, a new reaction has achieved criticality. The chain reaction of revenge has begun. It will not stop until it consumes its target, or him. The New Mexico sun was a brute. It did not shine. It hammered the earth into a flat, bleached plate of dust and pain. It baked the squat utilitarian buildings of Los Alamos into a monochrome of tan and gray, stripping the world of softness and shadow. For Dr. Leo Stern, stepping from the military truck onto this soil felt less like an arrival and more like a landing on a hostile, alien planet. The air, thin and scouring, carried the scent of pine resin and concrete, a far cry from the damp salt and ancient stone of Copenhagen. This was not a refuge. It was a fortress, and he was walking into its heart, a Trojan horse of flesh and bone. Security was a multi-headed beast. It was not just the barbed wire fences gleaming in the cruel light, or the watchtowers where dark figures stood, still as lizards. It was in the eyes of the MP at the gate, who scrutinized his papers with a dispassionate thoroughness that felt surgical. It was in the fingerprint ink, cold and stubborn, that stained his fingertips. It was in the impersonal, echoing room where a man in a crisp uniform recited the Official Secrets Act, each word a brick in a wall meant to entomb him. Leo repeated the oaths, his voice flat. Each promise felt like a layer of false skin he was pulling over his true intent. The ranch school, converted into a labyrinth of laboratories and barracks, hummed with a frenetic, manic energy. It was the sound of civilization's most brilliant minds being pushed to the brink. The clatter of calculators was a metallic chorus. Through open doorways, he caught glimpses of chaotic blackboards, frenzied with symbols and frantic arrows. Young men in shirt sleeves rushed past, their faces etched with a unique combination of intellectual euphoria and profound exhaustion. The air crackled with a terrible purpose. This was the engine room of the apocalypse, and they were all stoking the boiler. His introduction to the inner circle was a quiet storm. J. Robert Oppenheimer, a man whose intensity seemed to warp the space around him, fixed Leo with eyes of glacial blue. The handshake was brief, the assessment instantaneous. Oppenheimer did not see a refugee. He saw a resource, a component to be integrated into the machine. Bohr speaks highly of your work on neutron moderation, he said. The word's not a compliment, but a deployment of data. We are behind. The Germans may be ahead. Your perspective will be instrumental. The unspoken question hung in the air. Which side of your perspective? The others were a constellation of genius, each burning with their own strange flame. Enrico Fermi, practical and towering, exuded a calm, volcanic power. Richard Feynman, a whirlwind of chaotic brilliance, seemed to vibrate with a different physics. And there was Klaus Fuchs, quiet, polite, his eyes perpetually downcast behind round glasses, a man who carried his own secrets like a second shadow. Leo shook each hand, feeling the weight of their minds, recognizing in some a shared European trauma, in others a terrifying American innocence. He was the odd piece, the one with the freshest scars. His assigned workspace was a small, sun-bleached office overlooking the canyon. Its starkness was a blessing. Here he began the meticulous, double-layered work of building trust. By day, he buried himself in the American problem. He absorbed the mountains of data on plutonium breeding, on the sinister properties of this man-made element. He studied the nascent, terrifying design of the implosion device, a geometric puzzle of perfect, synchronized violence. He offered corrections, insights drawn from a deep well of theory. He was careful, precise, invaluable. He watched as the gadget, a sphere of high explosives and plutonium, began to take shape in diagrams and whispered conversations. He felt the terrifying momentum of the project, a boulder rolling downhill, gaining speed. And with every genuine solution he provided, he carefully, secretly, siphoned the raw material for his own parallel project. At night, under the green glass shade of a single desk lamp, while the mesa winds howled like the furies outside, Leo became a forger of realities. He opened a plain, government-issued notebook. This was the birthplace of Operation Mirage. He did not simply alter numbers. He constructed an entire, elegant, believable universe of failure. Using the real American data as his foundation, he began to design a phantom bomb for the Nazis. He took the critical mass calculations for plutonium. In his notebook, he subtly introduced a neutron poison effect, a theoretical impurity in the German heavy water supply that would dampen the chain reaction, requiring not kilograms, but tens of kilograms of material, an impossible demand. He worked on the implosion problem, the heart of the American effort. In his false narrative, he crafted a flaw in the lensing system of conventional explosives, a minuscule error in the shock wave synchronization that would guarantee a fizzle, a non-nuclear explosion scattering precious, irradiated fuel to the winds. The lies were beautiful in their internal consistency, each supporting the other, a castle of sand built to look like granite. The act was a profound psychological violation. Every truth he told by day was used to craft a lie by night. He felt himself splitting, a human isotope separating into two distinct entities, the loyal physicist of Los Alamos and the vengeful ghost of Copenhagen. The strain was a constant low-grade fever. He jumped at sudden noises. He found himself staring at his own equations, wondering which set was real. He avoided prolonged eye contact with Elsa, who had been housed in the women's dormitories a world away. Her letters, when they managed to pass the censors, spoke of quiet fear and a growing distance. He could not bridge it. The canyon between them was now filled with the dark matter of his secret. The first test of his infiltration was not scientific, but human. A security officer, Major John Briggs, a man with the calm demeanor of a tombstone and eyes that missed nothing, began to appear. He was not hostile, merely present. He would ask seemingly casual questions over bad coffee in the commissary. The weather in Denmark, was it as dry as this, Professor Stern? Your colleague, Dr. Wagner, a tragic loss. Did he ever speak of his work in Berlin? The questions were needles, probing for a seam in his story. Leo learned to answer with a careful mixture of truth and mournful vagueness, his accent thickening slightly with emotion, a shield of victimhood. He knew the first transmission had to be sent. The contact instructions from Wagner's note, memorized and then destroyed, pointed to a cutout in New York. Using the pretext of requesting specific European journals from a scientific library, he encoded the initial, least sensitive layer of his deception into a seemingly innocent request for photocopies. The act of handing the letter to the military postal clerk felt like releasing a vial of invisible nerve gas into the world. He stood for a moment, watching the man stamp the envelope, feeling a wave of nauseating vertigo. There was no turning back. That night, he lay on his narrow bunk, the springs digging into his back. Through the window, the stars over the New Mexico desert were impossibly bright, cold pinpricks in a vast black dome. In Copenhagen, they had been navigational guides, symbols of cosmic order. Here, under this brutal sky, they looked like the detached, observing eyes of a dispassionate universe. He was no longer a scientist seeking truth. He was an architect building a labyrinth for monsters, hoping to get lost in it himself. The crucible of Los Alamos was not just forging a bomb. It was forging him, tempering his soul into a blade of singular, terrible purpose. The heat was unbearable, but he could not step out of the fire. The work in Los Alamos evolved from frantic assembly into a grim, rhythmic heartbeat. The theoretical gadget began to materialize in high-security workshops, its components handled with a reverence bordering on religious dread. Leo Stern moved through this atmosphere like a deep-sea diver, the pressure a constant companion, threatening to crush his secret self while propelling his public persona forward. His value to the project solidified. He became a trusted voice on neutronics. His predictions on yield margins cited in meetings with Oppenheimer and General Groves. This trust was the very fuel for his private war. His personal crucible was a locked steel filing cabinet in the corner of his office, nondescript among others of its kind. Within it, nestled between genuine reports on boron shielding efficiencies, lay the growing tumor of Operation Mirage. The plain notebook was now supplemented by stolen graph paper, the margins filled with a precise, manic script. Here, Leo wasn't just tweaking numbers. He was authoring an entire tragic opera for the German uranium project. The core of his deception was a phantom. He created a detailed character for a non-existent German plutonium core. He gave it a density profile that was subtly irregular, a product of fictitious impurities in their heavy water reactors. He calculated, with flawless, damning logic, how this Schattenkern, shadow core, would behave under compression. In Leo's false data, the shock waves from the conventional explosives, no matter how perfectly arranged, would travel through this flawed material at inconsistent velocities. The spherical implosion, the miracle needed to trigger atomic fission, would become a lopsided, pathetic crumple. The numbers sang a song of inevitable, expensive failure. The psychological toll was a corrosive acid. He would present a real solution to a problem with the detonator timings, earning a nod of approval from George Kistiakowsky, the explosives expert. Hours later, alone, he would translate that very solution into the foundational error for the German design, corrupting his own genius into a weapon of sabotage. It felt like performing a brilliant surgery by day and using the same scalpel to craft a biological weapon by night. His hands, steady in the lab, would sometimes develop a faint tremor in the privacy of his quarters, a tremor he willed into submission through sheer force of memory. The memory of Wagner's desperate face, the echoing pistol crack over Blackwater. The mechanism of transmission was a tightrope strung across an abyss. The New York cutout, an antiquarian bookseller with secret sympathies, was a single point of catastrophic failure. Using the project's own need for obscure European scientific papers as cover, Leo devised a code of breathtaking audacity. He would request a specific, genuine article from a 1938 German physics journal. The page numbers he cited, however, corresponded to a pre-agreed cipher. A request for pages 144-147, with particular attention to the isotopic analysis in Figure 3, might instruct the recipient to prepare for a data drop. The misinformation itself was microfilmed. Stolen moments in the photography lab, his heart a trip hammer, as the machine whirred, reducing his lies to a tiny potent square. The microfilm was then secreted inside the binding of a heavy, legitimate textbook, being sent out for consultation. Each transmission was a white-knuckle descent into hell. The act of handing the packaged book to the armed courier, of watching it be logged and placed in a locked pouch, required a performance of absolute boredom. Inside, his organs seemed to twist. A single suspicious glance from the clerk, a random security check of the parcel, and it would all be over. He would be exposed not as a spy for the enemy, but as a rogue agent, waging a private war, a traitor to both sides, in the eyes of the law. The paranoia became a second shadow, longer and darker than the one cast by the New Mexico sun. He saw surveillance in every delayed glance, an accusation in every routine question from Major Briggs, whose casual chats now felt like slow, careful drilling into the bedrock of his cover story. The world outside his secret war provided no solace. Elsa, housed in the fenced compound for families, was adrift in a sea of ersatz domesticity. Their infrequent supervised walks were exercises in painful constraint. She spoke of the other wives' anxieties, of the strange, suspended life they led. She asked gentle questions about his work, which he deflected with vague allusions to pressure calculations and theoretical limits. The warmth that had sustained them in Copenhagen was now replaced by a polite, devastating chill. He could see the confusion in her eyes, the dawning suspicion that the man who had escaped with her was not the man who had arrived here. She was grieving for him, and he was powerless to stop it, lest his grief pull them both into the abyss. The breaking point came from an unexpected direction. A security memo, circulated to senior scientists, reported the arrest of a low-level technician in Oak Ridge for careless talk. The man faced 20 years in prison. The memo was a blunt instrument, a reminder of the monolithic power within which they all lived. That night, lying awake, Leo realized the true asymmetry of his gamble. The Americans feared secrets reaching the enemy. The Nazis, driven by Wagner's description of desperate, furious ignorance, craved them. He was not simply passing information. He was feeding a specific, ravenous addiction. He was providing the heroin of false validation to a regime dying of its own ideological poison. This was not just sabotage. It was a form of intellectual murder. He rose before dawn, drawn to his office. In the pre-light gloom, he opened the steel cabinet. He held the latest microfilm up to the green desk lamp. The tiny, perfect images of his false diagrams glowed with an eldritch light. This batch contained the finalized, flawed schematics for the explosive lenses, a masterpiece of deception, a Rube Goldberg machine of doom that would guarantee $1 million firework instead of a nuclear blast. He thought of Wagner's sacrificed life. He thought of the pistol crack. He thought of the oblivious German scientists in some reinforced bunker, studying this film with desperate hope, steering their entire program onto the rocks he had meticulously charted. A profound, unsettling quiet settled over him. The tremor in his hands was gone. The fear was still there, but it was now a tool, a sharp edge. He was no longer just a refugee physicist or a grieving friend, or a distant husband. He had become something else entirely, a phantom in the machine, a ghost in the core, whispering fatal lies into the ear of a colossus. He sealed the microfilm into its hiding place. The act was no longer one of panic, but of cold, deliberate delivery. The poison was packaged, the dose was calculated. All that remained was to watch the patient take it. Deep in the swollen, damp belly of the German earth, in a converted beer cellar in Haigerloch, the air was a thick soup of mildew, cold stone, and human resignation. This was the antechamber of the Nazi atomic dream, a dank, concrete womb where the great theoretical engine of German physics had sputtered to a pathetic, humming standstill. The reactor assembly, known as B-8, crouched in the center of the cavern like a primitive idol. A clumsy sphere of graphite and uranium cubes suspended by chains in a tank of heavy water. A grotesque parody of scientific ambition. Professor Werner Heisenberg, his face pared down to its elegant, anxious bones by years of war and moral calculus, stood before the apparatus. The clinical confidence he exhibited at lectures in Berlin was absent here, in the face of the thing itself. His eyes, once capable of visualizing the unseeable dance of electrons, now tracked the slow, lazy bubbles rising in the heavy water with a look of profound exhaustion. The data from their last experiment lay in his hand, a thin sheaf of papers that felt like a death certificate. The neutron multiplication was pitiful, the path to a critical chain reaction, a receding mirage. The frustration in the cavern was a physical presence, thick enough to taste. Elsewhere, in the administratively sterile but equally fraught offices of the Uranverein in Berlin, the mood was one of corrosive anxiety. Reports from the front were a litany of collapse. The window for a Wunderwaffe, a miracle weapon, was slamming shut. Each requisition for more graphite, more heavy water, more scarce resources was met with colder scrutiny from Speer's ministry. The pressure was no longer intellectual. It was existential, a vice tightening around the entire program. Into this atmosphere of desperation, Leo Stern's carefully crafted poison began to seep. The first transmission arrived through the labyrinthine channels of Swiss neutrality and Abwehr intrigue. It was not a dramatic dossier, but a series of seemingly innocuous technical abstracts, the kind of open-source intelligence gathered by scientific attachés. Buried within them, like fragments of a deadly virus, were Leo's initial mathematical suggestions. Hints that the American approach to plutonium breeding was fraught with a specific, insurmountable isotopic contamination. For the Germans, who had all but abandoned the plutonium route as too slow, this was not a warning, but a perverse validation. See, their collective thinking went, "We were right to focus on uranium. The Americans are wasting their time on a dead end." The data didn't just inform them. It flattered their existing prejudices, which made it all the more believable. The second, more potent packet arrived weeks later. This one required a secure decoder and a meeting in a soundproofed room in the Reich Ministry. It contained Leo's masterpiece, the Schattenkern analysis. The diagrams were crisp, the mathematics impeccable, bearing the unforgeable hallmarks of a first-rate nuclear mind. They presented a detailed tragic case study of a failed plutonium implosion. To Heisenberg and his team, studying the papers under the harsh light of a single bulb, it was a revelation. It wasn't just that the American design was flawed. The analysis implicitly outlined why their own different path, the uranium machine, the heavy water moderator, was the only sane choice. The phantom core's failure was so elegantly explained, so physically plausible, it served to reinforce the walls of their own conceptual prison. The effect was catastrophic and subtle. No one stood up and declared the bomb impossible. Instead, a collective, weary sigh seemed to pass through the program. The frantic, parallel research into fast fission and explosive lensing, already on life support, was quietly defunded. Manpower was shifted back to the reactor project, to the endless, grinding problem of achieving a sustained reaction, a power source, not a bomb. Leo's lies did not starve the German bomb project. They convinced it to willingly put itself on a strict technical diet, leading it to a banquet of irrelevance. We see the human cost of this deception in the cavern at Hygerloch. A young, brilliant physicist named Eric, who had privately nurtured a radical idea for fast neutron initiation, is now seen meticulously adjusting the uranium cubes on the reactor pile, his personal dream shelved. He works with a dutiful dullness, the fire of innovation extinguished by the top-down certainty that his path was a fantasy. The senior scientists, reviewing Leo's data, nod with grim satisfaction. The numbers confirm their deepest, most secret fear, that the task is Herculean, the timeline impossible. It absolves them of the ultimate responsibility. They are not failing the fatherland. The universe itself is proving intractable. Leo's falsehoods become the alibi for their conscience. In Berlin, the bureaucratic gears turn, fueled by this intelligence. A memo is prepared for Speer. It states, with newfound empirical backing from intercepted Allied research, that while the uranium machine holds promise as an energy source, a deliverable explosive device is a project of many years, not months. Resources should be allocated accordingly. The word Jahr, year, is underlined. The Nazi atomic bomb is not declared dead. It is administratively, and with a semblance of scientific justification, placed in a deep coma. The scene shifts back to Hygerloch, the perpetual drip of water from the ceiling marking the passage of irreplaceable time. Heisenberg stands before the silent, dormant reactor pile. The data from Stern's transmission is folded in his pocket. He looks at the chains, the cubes, the murky water. A profound ambiguity settles on his features. Is it the disappointment of a man who has seen the pinnacle recede? Or is it the grim relief of a man who has just been handed from an enemy he does not know a certificate of moral pardon? The reactor offers no answers. It simply sits, a monument to a colossal effort that has been expertly, invisibly misdirected into a concrete hole in the ground. The echo in the cavern is no longer one of potential energy, but of a future that has just been meticulously, surgically erased. The silence is Leo Stern's first monumental victory, heard by no one but the ghosts of the coming peace. A tremor entered the machinery of Los Alamos. It was not a seismic shift, but a fine, high-frequency vibration of distrust that began to warp the very air. It started with the arrest of Klaus Fuchs in England. The news arrived not as a public announcement, but as a seismic rumor that shot through the technical corridors and cafeterias, a shockwave of silent, panicked realization. One of them, a physicist, a trusted member of the inner circle, the enemy, had been in the room. For Leo Stern, the news was an ice-water flood. His first, primal instinct was not fear for the project, but a terrifying, specific calculation. Had Fuchs used the same channels? Were the cutouts in New York, the Swiss intermediaries, now compromised? His own secret operation, a parallel track to Fuchs's treason, suddenly risked collision. He forced himself to breathe, to think. Fuchs was a communist, spying for Moscow. His motivations were ideological, his network almost certainly separate. But in the paranoid ecosystem of wartime intelligence, connections were conjured from coincidence. Fuchs's exposure would turn every foreign-born scientist, every refugee with an accent, into a potential suspect. The light was about to become unbearably bright. General Leslie Groves, a man whose boundless ambition was matched only by his boundless suspicion, descended upon the mesa like an avenging glacier. Security, already oppressive, became suffocating. New layers of clearance were imposed. Mail was no longer merely censored. It was subjected to cryptographic analysis. Random searches of living quarters, once unthinkable, were now routine. The atmosphere curdled from one of urgent collaboration to one of mutual surveillance. Scientists eyed each other over shared calculations, wondering who had access, who had motive. Major John Briggs ceased being a periodic presence and became a constant one. His office, once a distant administrative cell, now felt like the true nerve center. He summoned Leo. The room was bare, functional, lit by a single harsh bulb. Briggs did not sit behind his desk. He leaned against it, a picture of casual, lethal scrutiny. He began not with accusations, but with a recitation of facts. He spoke of Leo's escape from Copenhagen, the route through Sweden, the names of the fishermen, details Leo thought buried. He spoke of Dr. Carl Wagner, his execution, his known dissident leanings. Briggs's voice was flat, a detective assembling a timeline. Then he pivoted. He laid out the staggering scale of Fuchs's betrayal, the specifications for the gaseous diffusion plant at Oak Ridge, the implosion design sketches, the yield predictions. The damage was incalculable. "Professor Stern," Briggs said, his eyes never leaving Leo's face. "Fuchs gave them the blueprints. He gave them the truth. What would be the point, do you suppose, of someone giving them a lie?" The question hung in the air, a precisely aimed scalpel. Leo felt the floor beneath him turn to glass. Briggs was not on the trail of a spy. He was on the trail of something more bizarre, more anomalous, a pattern of intelligence that didn't fit. The intercepted German communications, the puzzling lack of progress on their bomb program, the strange, self-contradictory technical data that had begun to filter back from European sources via OSS. Someone was feeding the Germans bad information. And Briggs, a hunter of patterns, had sniffed the scent of a phantom. Leo's defense was a masterpiece of performed offense. He let the color rise in his face, not from guilt, but from a deep, wounded fury. He spoke of the cattle cars, of Wagner's murder, of the absolute, personal nature of his war against the Reich. His voice, usually soft, hardened into a blade of accented steel. "You think, Major, after what they have taken, after what they would do to my wife, my child, that I would lift a finger to help them? To give them anything?" He leaned forward, invading Briggs's space. The point would be to watch them fail. The point would be to waste their last resources. The point would be revenge. It was a dangerous gambit, confessing to a motive just short of the crime. But it played on Briggs's understanding of hatred. It was human, visceral. It was not the cold ideology of Fuchs. Briggs's expression did not soften, but a flicker of reassessment passed behind his eyes. He had no proof, only a ghost of a theory. And Leo had just given the ghost a believable, emotional shape. But the reprieve was temporary. The net was tightening in other ways. Elsa, in the women's compound, was visited by a friendly, smiling female agent from the WAC. Over terrible coffee, the woman chatted about the stress on families, the difficulty of not knowing what their husbands were doing. She asked innocent questions about Leo's state of mind, about his late nights, about whether he ever mentioned colleagues back in Europe. Elsa, terrified and fiercely protective, gave away nothing. But that night, when Leo saw her on their sanctioned walk, he saw a new fear in her eyes, a fear of him, of the stranger he was becoming, of the invisible danger his secret life was pulling them into. Their conversation was a minefield of things unsaid. The chasm between them was now complete. They stood on opposite sides, shouting into a void. The pressure reached its zenith when Leo was instructed to prepare a comprehensive summary of all known German progress for a high-level briefing with Groves and Oppenheimer. It was the ultimate test. He had to weave his lies into the fabric of the truth so seamlessly that not even the sharpest minds could spot the thread. He spent 3 sleepless nights assembling the report. In it, he presented the German program as technically sophisticated but fundamentally misguided, led down a fruitless path by their own flawed assumptions and resource limitations. He cited the intercepted data he himself had created as evidence of their embarrassing failures with plutonium. He was analyzing his own handiwork, vouching for its authenticity. Presenting the report was an out-of-body experience. He stood before the 2 most powerful men of the Manhattan Project, the fluorescent light humming overhead. Groves's bulldog face was inscrutable. Oppenheimer's gaunt profile was turned, listening intently. Leo spoke with clinical detachment, pointing to graphs and diagrams, explaining why the Nazi bomb was a phantom. Every word was a lie wrapped in a truth. He was not just deceiving the enemy now. He was sculpting the official American understanding of that enemy. He was, in that moment, the sole author of a false history. As he finished, Oppenheimer turned, pinning him with those piercing blue eyes. There was a long, heavy silence, a tragic misallocation of intellect. Oppenheimer finally murmured, more to himself than to anyone. Groves merely grunted, his eyes on Leo, not on the report. The approval was given, the assessment accepted. Leo had passed. He walked back to his office through the brilliant, indifferent New Mexico afternoon. He had never felt more alone or more powerful. He had stared directly into the gaze of the project's overlords and lied to their faces. And they had believed him. The unraveling had not exposed him. It had woven him more deeply into the fabric of the lie. He was no longer a passenger in the machine. He had become one of its essential hidden gears, guiding the entire monstrous enterprise with the silent, invisible pressure of his deceit. The victory tasted like ashes and ozone. He had won the battle with Briggs, but the war within himself was now a scorched earth campaign, and there would be no survivors. The news from Europe did not arrive as a cable or an official dispatch. It seeped into Los Alamos through the opaque, guarded channels of military intelligence, a toxic rumor first whispered in the secure comms room before it found its way, mangled and sharp, to Leo Stern. The Swiss cutout was gone. Not compromised, not arrested, eliminated. The antiquarian bookseller in New York's network had been rolled up by the Gestapo's foreign counterintelligence arm, the Geheime Feldpolizei. The precise, delicate machinery of Leo's deception had not just stalled, it had been seized, dismantled, and its components were now being scraped for fingerprints under hot lights in some Berlin cellar. This was not an abstract security breach. It was a surgical strike at the core of his being. For Leo, the Swiss contact had been a phantom limb, a neutral, mechanical relay. The true nexus, the origin point of his entire vendetta, was Karl Wagner, the man who had pressed the oilskin packet into his hand on the Copenhagen dock, whose face was a mask of preemptive guilt and desperate hope. The full story arrived days later, a cold, clinical paragraph buried in an OSS summary of Axis intelligence operations. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic euphemism. Wagner had been apprehended at the German-Swiss border near Schaffhausen. Charge: treasonous dissemination of state secrets and conspiracy to sabotage the Uranverein. Interrogation had been thorough. He had maintained his silence regarding the ultimate recipient of his betrayal for 72 hours. On the morning of the fourth day, he had been executed by firing squad at the Volheide prison camp. The report noted, with detached admiration, that his silence had likely preserved the operational security of an unknown Allied intelligence asset. Leo read the paragraph in his office, the paper trembling not from fear, but from a seismic, internal collapse. The sterile words exploded in his mind, reconstructing the horror in high-definition clarity. He saw the cold cellar, the single bulb, the methods that would have been employed to break a physicist's mind. He heard the silence Wagner had maintained, a silence that was not just resistance, but a deliberate, sacrificial act of continuation. Wagner had not just given him a tool, he had given him a covenant, and had paid for it with his body, his mind, and finally, his life. The echo of that single pistol shot over the water in Copenhagen now had a source, a name, and a duration of agony. The weight of it crushed Leo's calculated fury. This was no longer a game of intellectual vengeance, a clever gambit of false constants and engineered failures. He had been drawing lines of theoretical murder on graph paper, and a real man had bled out at the intersection. Wagner's death transformed Operation Mirage from a masterpiece of deceit into a spiritual burden of impossible mass. Every equation Leo had corrupted was now stained with that blood. Every lie he had sent was a weight Wagner had carried into his cell. The noble cause curdled into something monstrous. He had asked for a sword, and Wagner had handed him the hilt, already warm from his own grasp as he fell on the blade. This personal cataclysm coincided with the project's own violent pivot toward finality. The atmosphere in Los Alamos shed its last vestiges of theoretical struggle. It became a factory for the apocalypse. The gadget was no longer a collection of ideas. Its plutonium core, nicknamed the Demon in hushed tones, was a real, warm, metallic presence in a guarded vault. The high explosive lenses were being cast and machined with jeweler's precision, each one a piece of a planet-killing puzzle. The test, codenamed Trinity, was no longer an if but a when. The mesa thrummed with a terrifying, focused energy, the sound of a civilization building its own self-destruct button and preparing, with grim excitement, to press it. Leo was trapped in the chasm between these two realities. He was required to attend the final coordination meetings for Trinity, to review the yield predictions based partly on his own genuine work. He sat among the other scientists, their faces etched with a potent mix of anxiety and awe, and felt like an imposter from a dead world. They were discussing barometric pressure and fallout patterns. He was seeing Wagner against a wall, his glasses broken in the dirt. They were talking about the flash, the fireball, the thunderclap. He was hearing the volley of the firing squad. His work on the German program was finished. The last, most critical packet, the definitive proof of the implosion design's fatal flaw, had been sent before the network collapsed. It was out there, a ghost in the German machine, doing its silent work. His mission was accomplished, and it felt like the greatest failure of his life. He sought a solitary, physical purge. Late one night, under the cover of a moonless sky, he walked far into the desert, beyond the perimeter fences, carrying a small shovel. The hardpan earth fought him, but he dug, sweat, and something else salting the soil. Into the hole, he placed the silver lighter from Bohr and the charred oilskin-wrapped corner of Wagner's original note, the one with the flawed diagram he had saved against his heart. They were the sacred relics of his holy war, now too poisoned to bear. He covered them, stamping the earth flat, erasing the grave. He stood there, breath ragged, under the sprawl of the indifferent stars. He had buried the man he was when he started this, but the man he had become had no grave to go to. Returning to the compound at dawn, ghost-pale and dust-covered, he encountered Major Briggs on the path. Briggs took in his disheveled state, the dirt under his nails, the hollowed-out look in his eyes. It was not the look of a spy or a traitor. It was the look of a man who had seen the cost of his own victory and found the price unacceptable. Briggs said nothing. He merely gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was not an absolution. It was a recognition. He finally understood the nature of the ghost he had been hunting. It wasn't a specter of treason, but a phantom of conscience, more terrifying and more human than any ideology. Leo walked past him, toward the barbed wire fences and the buildings where the final assembly was beginning. He had won. He had crippled a monster. And in doing so, he had turned himself into a living tomb, haunted by the one man who had believed in his revenge enough to die for it. The cost of the shadow was the light within himself, and it was extinguished. The chain reaction of his lies had reached its terminus, leaving only a silent radioactive despair. July 16th, 1945. The Jornada del Muerto desert existed in a state of suspended agony. The air itself seemed to have been vacuumed out, leaving behind a dry electric stillness that pressed against the eardrums. At base camp, 10 miles from ground zero, the nervous energy of the previous days had hardened into a terrible, silent waiting. Men moved like somnambulists, their faces pale smears under the glare of the pre-dawn floodlights. They were not scientists now. They were acolytes at an altar, about to witness either a miracle or the opening of a door that could never be closed. Leo Stern stood among them, a statue of ash in a trench coat. He had been given welder's glass to shield his eyes, a pathetic talisman against what was to come. He clutched it, feeling the grit of the desert embedded in its frame. Around him, the elite of the Manhattan Project were reduced to base human instincts. Some joked with a brittle, hysterical edge. Others prayed silently. Oppenheimer, a skeletal wraith leaning against a support beam, simply stared into the southwestern darkness, his lips moving, as if reciting a private apocalyptic verse. Leo felt no camaraderie with them. He was an observer from a dead planet, his war already over, his soul already spent. His mind was not on the tower that stood 10 miles away, crowned with the device, the ugly practical name they'd given the nest of explosives and plutonium they called the gadget. His mind was in a cellar in Berlin with Wagner. His mind was on the ghostly uranium pile in the Hygerlock cave, inert and useless, a monument to his success. This American spectacle felt obscene, a grotesque victory parade for a race he had already run and won in the shadows. He was here to witness, not the birth of the atomic age, but the funeral pyre of his own humanity, a confirmation that his brilliant, poisonous lies had merely cleared the field for another, more brazen monster to be born. The countdown crackled over the scratchy loudspeaker, a voice from the control bunker, slicing through the silence. The numbers were a metronome for the end of the world. 10, 9. He thought of Elsa and Anna, asleep in the Los Alamos compound, unaware. 8, 7. He thought of the charred fragment of Wagner's note, buried in the desert behind him. 6, 5. He closed his eyes behind the glass, not to shield them from light, but from the vision of his own hand. In all of this. 4, 3. He had wanted to cripple a weapon. He had helped create one. 2, 1. The universe broke. It was not a sight first, but a violent, physical rewriting of reality. A light that was not a light. A whiteness that obliterated perception, that poured through the welder's glass, through his closed eyelids, through the flesh of his face, and imprinted itself directly onto the back of his skull. It was the total and absolute negation of darkness, a silent scream of pure energy. For an eternity that lasted milliseconds, the world was only this bleaching, silent fury. Then the sound arrived. Not a bang, but the fabric of the sky being torn in two from horizon to horizon. A deep, visceral roar that started in the bones and shook the earth beneath his feet. It was the thunder of God breaking his own commandments. Finally, the fireball. It rose, a miniature, hideous sun born from the sand, swirling in psychedelic hues of violet, orange, and a malevolent, primordial gold. It climbed, an expanding, rolling hemisphere of annihilation, sucking the darkness of the desert into its furnace heart. The heat wave hit them next, a dry, searing wind that carried the scent of ozone and crushed minerals, the desert exhaling its death rattle. Around Leo, reactions erupted. A cheer, wild and unhinged, went up from some. A sob from others. Beth muttered numbers, calculating yield in a tone of awe-struck terror. Oppenheimer whispered the line from the Bhagavad Gita, his face a mask of tragic grandeur. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. Leo remained silent. He lowered his welder's glass. The fireball was now a towering, stabilizing column, the stem boiling with hellish red dust, the head blooming into the iconic, malignant mushroom that would haunt the dreams of every human alive. He did not see a triumph of science. He did not see the end of a war. He saw the visualized, triumphant echo of his own failure. He had stopped one nation's bomb only to pour his genius into the heart of another's. His lies had been a scalpel, precise and clean. This was a sledgehammer, blunt and world-shattering. The light was not illumination. It was an X-ray, exposing the hollow man he had become. In that moment he received the silent, absolute proof of his secondary victory, the complete, utter lack of a corresponding event in Europe. No German fireball had ever stained the sky. No Nazi shockwave had ever shaken the earth. The silence from that front was louder than Trinity's thunder. His phantom core, his flawed schematics, his whispers of impossibility, they had worked. The Hygerlock cave was just a cave. The Uranverein was just a stack of paper. He had, single-handedly, with the weapon of his mind, defanged the nuclear aspirations of the Third Reich. The knowledge was a poison chalice. He had won his war. and in winning, he had lost everything else. He stood as the churning, radioactive cloud climbed higher, painting the dawn with its deathly hues. He was the author of two histories, one of devastating success and one of devastating prevention. They canceled each other out, leaving zero, a perfect, hollow equation. He turned his back on the spectacle, on the cheering, the crying, the awe-struck analysis. He began the long walk back toward the transport trucks, a solitary figure in the false dawn. The light from the blast cast his shadow far ahead of him, a long, thin, distorted black streak pointing back toward humanity. It was the only proof he needed. He was the ghost now. He had traded his life for a shadow on the desert floor, and the world, illuminated by the light of 1,000 suns, would never know what he had done or what it had cost. The victory was absolute, and it tasted of nothing but ash and a silence more profound than any explosion. The end was not an arrest, a trial, or a dramatic confrontation. It was an administrative euthanasia. In the sterile aftermath of Trinity and the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the machinery of the Manhattan Project began to disassemble itself, its purpose grimly fulfilled. For its human components, there were medals, promotions, and prestigious university chairs waiting. For Dr. Leo Stern, there was a quiet, firm severance. The meeting took place in a denuded office in Washington, D.C., the walls bare, the carpet marked with the ghosts of departed furniture. Major Briggs, now Lieutenant Colonel Briggs, was present, but he was not in charge. That role fell to a civilian from the Atomic Energy Commission, a man with the smooth, placid face of a career undertaker. The words were precise, legal, and utterly final. In light of persistent security anomalies and unresolved questions regarding undisclosed external contacts during the war period, Dr. Stern's security clearance was permanently revoked. His services were no longer required by the United States government or any of its affiliated research institutions. A one-time severance payment was offered, not as compensation, but as a token of silence. The message was clear. Disappear. There was no fight left in Leo. He accepted the terms with a numb nod. He had expected prison, or worse. This was a different kind of execution. They were not killing his body. They were burying his intellect, the very core of his identity. They were interring him alive in the ordinary. Elsa tried for a time. In a small, sunlit apartment in Chicago, paid for with the guilt money from the government, she attempted to rebuild the fragments of a life. She hung curtains. She cooked meals. She enrolled Anna in a new school. But the man who shared the space with them was a haunting. Leo would sit for hours staring at the pattern of light on the wall, his mind trapped in a silent calculus of cause and effect that had no solution. He was physically present, a monument to absence. The love she had for the man who had spirited her from Copenhagen could find no purchase in the hollowed-out shell that remained. One evening he found her crying silently at the kitchen table, not in anger, but in mourning. She was not leaving him. She was acknowledging that he was already gone. They separated with a devastating, polite sorrow. It was the paperwork of a death that had already occurred. Leo drifted north to a small, obscure liberal arts college in Minnesota, a place of red brick and whispering elms, as far from the deserts and secret cities as he could imagine. They hired him as a low-level instructor of introductory physics, a curiosity, the visiting professor with the faint German accent and the impenetrable sadness behind his eyes. His world shrank to the confines of a chalkboard. The simple elegance of Newton's laws. The predictable orbit of introductory lab assignments. He taught students who would become doctors, engineers, housewives, their minds untouched by the terrible sublimity of the quantum world he had helped weaponize. He spoke of gravity, of momentum, of energy, and never once of chain reactions or critical mass. His life became a study in controlled decay. His apartment was a cell of books and silence. He took walks along the frigid gray shores of Lake Superior, the vast, empty water, a pale imitation of the Black Sea he had crossed. He was a ghost in a peaceful land, a secret carved into a piece of moving flesh. Then, one autumn afternoon, a plain, manila envelope arrived in his campus mailbox. It bore no return address, only a faded Swiss postmark. His heart, long dormant, gave a single, painful thud. His hands, which could now demonstrate the pendulum's swing with steady grace, trembled as he slit it open. Inside was no letter, just a single, brittle page from a German scientific journal, Die Naturwissenschaften, dated 1948. It was a short, obscure obituary notice for the Uranium Club, a dry summation of a failed wartime project. A paragraph mentioned the Hygerlock reactor experiment, noting its inherent technical limitations and ultimate strategic irrelevance. The language was cold, academic, a post-mortem for a stillborn idea. Paperclipped to the corner of the page was a small, faded photograph. It showed the interior of the Hygerlock cave, now stripped and abandoned. The reactor vessel was gone, only the circular impression in the concrete floor remained, like a fossil. In the foreground, slightly blurred, was the back of a man in a heavy coat, his head bowed, as if inspecting the empty space where the heart of the Nazi atomic dream had once pulsed. Leo's breath caught. He knew that stoop, the set of those shoulders. It was Werner Heisenberg. Someone had turned the photograph over. On the back, in a precise, familiar handwriting that was not Heisenberg's, were two words, written in faint but unwavering ink, F.R. Leo, and beneath it a single devastating signature, not a name, a symbol, the schematic diagram of an atomic nucleus, crudely drawn with a single deliberate break in its orbit, a neutron escaping. It was the mark of the saboteur. It was the signature of Carl Wagner. A sound escaped Leo's throat, something between a gasp and a sob. It was not a message of thanks from an enemy. It was an acknowledgement from a ghost. Wagner had planned for this. He had prepared a courier, a dead man's switch in the world of neutral academia, to deliver this final proof, this absolution from beyond the grave. The silence had been broken. Someone knew. The one man who had shared the covenant knew he had fulfilled it. Leo did not burn this paper. He sat in the weak afternoon light filtering through his office window. The rustle of students passing in the hallway, a world away. He looked at the photograph of the empty cave, the hollow where a monster had failed to grow. He looked at the two words that carried the weight of a life sacrificed. He carefully placed the page and the photograph back into the envelope. He did not file it away. He simply sat, holding it in his hands, feeling the weight of the knowledge it contained. It changed nothing. It altered no fact of his exile, his loneliness, his shattered family. The mushroom cloud still rose in his nightmares. The desert light still burned behind his eyes. But now, in the profound silence of his unmarked life, there was a single resonant note of truth. His war had not been a dream. His sacrifice had not been a fiction. His revenge had not been in vain. In the ledger of history, written in blood and fire, his line was a zero, a perfect, silent negation. He had added nothing to the sum of human destruction. He had subtracted a universe of possible evil. He placed the envelope in the center of his empty desk. He stood up, straightened his worn jacket, and picked up a piece of chalk. The next class was waiting. He walked to the lecture hall, the ghost of a man, carrying within him the unbearable solitary weight of a victory no one would ever celebrate, a secret that was finally and only his to bear. The door closed softly behind him.